At the beginning of this unusual story, we can see some skulls with a burning blue fire inside, a multitude of human-looking creatures walking across some infernal bridge, and the river over which this bridge was built was called the River of Death. Many people died going up the mountain with thorns piercing their bodies. There was also someone or something resembling death ruling hell. In hell, people fell into something like lava, which melted people in an instant. These stories cannot be retold by their descendants without harming karma. And this monster sitting on a throne told some kid he was gonna spend eternity in hell. As it turned out, it wasn't the first time he'd had this nightmare. It was 12 o'clock in the afternoon. His name is Farrell, and right now he is late for a date. It's a very important day for him. It's his 3rd anniversary with his girlfriend, and he's proposing to her. But now Farrell can't afford a diamond ring, not even for his sweetheart. He bought a phone she likes, and Farrell's sure she'll be. His gaze fell on the car next to him, a very cool car he could only dream about. And then this girl starts walking up, and what Farrell saw made him speechless. It was because there was a man standing next to her, and his girlfriend said they had to break up. The gift he was holding, he just dropped it on the floor, and they drove off in a car. Farrell wondered only one thing: why had she left him? Apparently without a rich father, no matter how much effort you put in, you'll never get anywhere. He continued to stand in that crosswalk as some man walked toward him. They collided, and Farrell went on thinking that if all this had happened for lack of luck, then the story that he was really unlucky just started, and the thing in that guy's hand broke. As it turns out, it was this guy's family heirloom, so he argued that Farrell should pay for it. But you could tell he didn't understand what was going on, and why he had to pay for it. And that's when he was armed by a couple of thugs with red eyes like monsters. Farrell himself, and had no time to notice them when they were already at his back, and might attack at any time. Some guys started taking away this gift, telling Farrell that he had to pay for it, to which he replied that he didn't have any money, and the man didn't understand how he dared, so he ordered him to beat him up. The same man claimed Farrell has a cell phone, so they can sell it for $500. He was on his knees, and he wondered what he could do to those stupid thugs now. After which he picked up the very shattered broken relic in his hands, pondering them. How this shit could have happened. He didn't mean for it to happen, and it's not his fault. But he just threw it away, said it shows up in his dreams, and now he's behind this thing. And at the same moment, he only wanted to sigh, but she flew back at him. Before Farrell could even twitch, the relic slammed right into him, and even threw him off. After which some writing started popping up about the recovery system. Farrell's owner was found, identified as Satan, and he couldn't figure out if he was asleep, if he was passing through time and space. Some creature of hell began, and Farrell appeared in some space, and in front of him was a building of which he was just puzzled by, because it was all beyond his comprehension. The entrance to this building was lighted up, and there were apples scattered about, and there stood a tree without leaves. The sign explicitly said it was Satan's palace, which raised even more questions. Farrell thought it was some kind of joke, because it couldn't be. It was all just a crazy successful life. He was probably beaten to a pulp. And then there's a voice from somewhere that says the owner has given up his satanic identity, and the system will destroy him. The countdown began to 10, 9, 8. Farrell couldn't believe it was serious. Because he was scared, he started saying he changed his mind, and he offered to talk about it. Right in front of him appeared some kind of huge board, with the number 7 in the center of it, and he glowed again. He had some kind of aura, and his hand started to literally disintegrate. And then he said he'd register, and he ran into that building, afraid he was gonna die. Ran over there, and touched this very board and asked him to stop the countdown. This board shone and the numbers disappeared, and I guess that was a good sign. His only question was, had the countdown stopped? As it turns out, yes, he will live, and the registration has been finalized. And of course, he wanted to know what this man needed. What kind of nightmare is this? It seems so real. A sign appeared on this board, with a trial task: catch any ghost within 3 days. The reward of the task is the ghost control skill. Failure, the trial ends, and the worthless owner will be eliminated. And of all these, Farrell didn't like what he said about the worthless owner. He was furious that this chick chose him, and now she wants to get rid of him and despises him. His girlfriend dumped him, his cell phone was stolen, someone beat him up, and now he's being humiliated by some bullshit. By the way, as far as the countdown goes, 10 is followed by 7 and 7 is followed by 4. Really? You want to play a joke on me? Satan, damn it. Farrell was pissed. He's got a sign that says his power is very high, so don't let him exceed that level. But Farrell decided if he wanted to play with him, he'd play along, become Satan, so he claims he wants to be the real Satan. Now that's his goal. And some obscure grin appeared behind him, with red eyes. Who said that with the yin-yang eyes and the notebook of life and death? Farrell didn't understand what this stuff was, or what he had to do to become Satan. A new task has begun. The reward for the task is permission to use artifacts such as yin-yang eyes and life and death notebooks. Failure of the task is no second life. No second life? So cruel, but he'll play with it, and by all means, he won't lose. The whole place started to collapse, to break into pieces, literally. And it was already in the exact same place it was originally, which was quite unusual. What he couldn't understand, was he just dreaming? Or was he hallucinating after being beaten up? But if it's a dream, why is he standing now, and what's on his leg? He had some ghost clinging to his leg that looked both terrifying and laughable. But Farrell was clearly frightened by the creature, and couldn't figure out what it was, which made snot come out of his nose and tears come out of his eyes, because he was so scared. And the ghost, holding onto his leg, was catching all these liquids right on his tongue. It made Farrell even more uncomprehending of this whole unorthodox situation. So he didn't hesitate long enough to just step on the ghost, since it didn't seem strong, and the task was done. And he realized that it was indeed an assignment. But wasn't it too easy? This ghost suddenly started to rise to his feet, even though Farrell didn't have any, which made Farrell himself a little surprised as he continued to watch the ghost. Even though he still didn't understand what it was or what he wanted him to do. He pressed himself against Farrell's leg, and Farrell himself did not understand why the ghost was trembling. Was he afraid? Why? Was he afraid of him? And then he noticed that some power so strong, maybe he and his ghost ran off somewhere, suspecting that in that direction was his home. So he ran like a madman, with fear inside him. While he was running, he became very exhausted, for he was quite weak. And standing there, he looked around, not knowing what the hell was going on. And then his gaze went upward, and there he noticed something that truly surprised him. On the roof of the building was some girl who, under the light of the moon, was also looking at Farrell. But it wasn't really the girl he was surprised at, but a certain Kirsten, who was standing right behind her, which he was very surprised to realize something was going on here. This girl was standing on the roof of this building taking selfies with a selfie stick. Meet Kirsten, the popular streamer. She's the real shining star, the cutie that the whole internet loves. Kirsten laughed and noticed Farrell, so she called out to him, thinking he couldn't see her. So she decided to ask Farrell to come up to her place and help with the filming. And Farrell knew what was about to happen to her, so he thought she was a fool. And one thing Kirsten couldn't understand was why the content recorded today seemed so strange. He used to be different, or maybe it's just her imagination. Farrell immediately started yelling at her to run as anything could happen. But Kirsten herself didn't understand what had happened and why she was down there shooting a video. Temporarily there was a dead silence of incomprehension and fear, and a lump rose in Farrell's throat with fear for her. This woman standing next to Kirsten was clearly very angry, and probably angry at Farrell. He noticed this power, which was deluged with unbridled anger and fury. Something unusual began to happen. The very ghost Farrell had tamed began to draw in air. While Farrell understood nothing and covered his face with his hands, the ghost was already fed up and hiccuping from it. But he did notice it, and he realized that it looked like the ghost was drunk and happy. But it didn't take long for the ghost to rejoice, for this girl was very angry with him. Then she swiftly began to fly towards them, opening her mouth to reveal fangs. Farrell couldn't quite figure out what was going on, and dodged and assumed it was a new assignment. She got closer and closer, striking again at high speed. When he received a test assignment, he received the content and the reward for the assignment. He gets hints on how to complete the task and gains new skills as he beats up his opponent, but there would be no mention of content for a new assignment, so he stopped and wondered if, no matter what the assignment was, Farrell stopped and asserted that he was Satan, he could handle it, so let her show him what she could do. She got angry when she heard such confident words, so she grabbed him. While Farrell was being squeezed harder and harder, Kirsten was filming it all, and also commenting that this guy is called a silly young man enjoying life, after which she asked the audience if she had disappointed them by seeing them, and Farrell continued his unsuccessful attempts to get her to run away. Kirsten continued to understand nothing, why she was running, what Farrell was doing. The ghost didn't understand what was going on, but tried to understand what they were saying, and thought he was told to bite. He tearfully claimed he just couldn't take it anymore. Kirsten said on camera that he was just a bit weird, and laughed uncomprehendingly, and then decided to make sure he was okay, and he was just messing with her. When she put her hand on his shoulder asking what was wrong with him, he was surprised, and didn't want to believe that she had come over. All he saw in his eyes was the defenseless Kirsten he wanted to protect. So he once again told her to run away, and the ghost figured something out for himself, for he heard the word bite, and his eyes lit up with enthusiasm for the cause. He suddenly lunged toward this so-called witch who grabbed Farrell. The ghost bit her right on the arm, which surprised and angered her at the same time. From the witch's twitching, Kirsten fell to the floor, covering her face with her hands due to fear. Farrell realized this was a mess, and something had to be done, or they were both dead. So he started trying to break free of her grip with all his might. He let go of her hand for a moment and relaxed, then licked himself and got ready to. And with the same fire in his eyes, he began to suck in the air around him again, and the witch noticed it. Farrell had the strength to break free of her grip, maybe because she was distracted by the ghost. Whereupon he turned and gave her an angry look, and grabbed her arm, and tossed it over his shoulder like a piece of fluff, which made the ghost wonder. And the ghost was bouncing off the floor on his big belly, just like a mashik. Farrell couldn't tell if he'd won or not, so he stayed on his guard. She actually woke up and started screaming that she was going to tear him apart, with a furious look on her face. But he knew he couldn't give her a chance or it would be bad again. For that reason, this time he truthfully ordered the ghost to consume her without a trace. He looked at Farrell seriously, and asked if he was sure about this decision, to which he exclaimed not to waste time, "That's an order, just absorb everything." The ghost laid its head right on her chest. Though it looked strange, it really wasn't. He started literally sucking the soul out of her body from where he put his head. Farrell stood very tired looking, hoping that it was finally and truly over. This witch put her hand up and asserted that she never hated, she didn't want to. Farrell was really surprised at what a strong and resilient woman she was. And then he noticed that something unusual was happening to his eyes. He could feel it. Apparently it was the same yin-yang eyes. And he saw that the ghost was a level 1 hungry ghost, and that girl was a level 3 cursed zone ghost. This woman started glowing gold and didn't know what was going on. She was surprised she hadn't turned into a ghost puppet and was aware of herself. And in that moment, she realized that whoever Farrell was giving orders to wasn't a ghostly puppet. And Farrell asked her about how she, a level 3 ghost, didn't come here to cause trouble, but she said it's not like that now, and asked me not to delay her revenge. So she abruptly tried to take to the skies like she'd done before, and she succeeded. But almost immediately, she realized something was wrong because she couldn't move. She turned her head and wondered if Farrell was behind the fact that she couldn't move. And she's freaking out again. What the hell is going on? She's a level 3. So I asked him who he was and flew in his direction. And he was thinking that the assignment should be done by now. So confused, and then he turned his head and saw the hand that was already near him, which made him realize it was a mess. But he realized he couldn't let Kirsten get hurt, so he covered her with his body first. But she couldn't hit him, and was surprised at that, just as Farrell was surprised that he was all right. As it turned out, the mission was still going on, so it was too early to relax. They both saw the inscription and stood puzzled, both Farrell and this ghost woman. Farrell himself couldn't figure out what he was missing, and the ghost of the woman who Farrell was. He started thinking aloud that he still had the right to use the notebook of life and death to complete the test assignment and become Satan, to which she was very surprised. Okay, Kirsten's finally asleep. His work here is done. Now we need to move on to something else. He started discussing with this ghost that since she can see the system, she's also connected to the mission. She ran into Satan. It must have been fate that brought her to him. So she starts telling Farrell that he must have been sent by the gods to help him get revenge and right her wrong. That's her mission. And yeah, she mentioned revenge a few times. So I asked her what happened to her. She started to tell him that her name was Zoe. She was a student at a regular university before she died, and she didn't know why this demon was after him after she turned him down a few times. And eventually, he raped her, which she seemed to have a hard time talking about. Farrell got really pissed off and started asking what the bastard's name was. She said his name was Brian, and then Farrell just fell asleep, and she called him a bastard. So she decided she'd never recognize a Satan like him who doesn't care about anyone. The next morning she woke up and started saying that yesterday that idiot Farrell seemed like. Kirsten couldn't understand why she couldn't remember anything, what had even happened yesterday. And there was a scream from the street calling her, telling her that her little brother Brian was here. Brian asked her if she would be willing to be his happy bride forever and ever. She was surprised the bastard was here again. She'd had enough of him coming around, so she decided she was gonna stay away from him and forget about him. She was sitting at the table saying to herself that she wasn't here, so let him just go. Brian started knocking on doors, asking her if she was afraid. She was shocked and didn't want him to use such disgusting methods. Besides, he had just been downstairs. How did he get to the door so fast? He asked Kirsten what she was doing so early in the morning, and she was surprised that Farrell was at her house, and asked what he was doing here. Farrell replied that they rent a house together. Isn't it weird to see him at home? She asked what he was doing. She asked him why he wasn't at work, but he said that yesterday he lost his girlfriend and his job. He'll be spending a lot of time at home. So he asked if there were any objections. Brian kept knocking and telling Kirsten he heard her voice, so he'd have her come and open the door for him. Because of this, she covered Farrell's mouth and told him to keep his voice down so he wouldn't hear the door opened and Brian said he could get in without a key. Surprised, he saw the two of them together and started asking who this guy was and what they were doing together. They both became embarrassed and began to look into each other's eyes, holding Farrell's face to theirs. Farrell started getting angry and claimed to Kirsten that they'd rented the house together and why she'd given the key to someone else. But she said she didn't give him the key, and she's kind of a weirdo. Asked him where he got the key from and threw something at him. Brian replied that the house of the girl he's looking for is his house. The key? It's just a matter of minutes. But who the hell this guy was, that's what Brian couldn't figure out, but he really wanted to. Farrell reluctantly told Brian he could go on. To begin with, Farrell decided to ask Kirsten what the man's name was. Surely Brian? But she said she didn't know the guy, and she didn't know why he suddenly showed up to propose. He must be crazy. And then Farrell remembers Zoe mentioning Brian's name, saying she wanted revenge. He went up to Kirsten and said he couldn't help it. He fell in love with her when he watched her stream. He'd been preparing for a long time, so let her marry him. But Kirsten claimed she doesn't even know him, so she can't take him up on his offer. Plus, she doesn't need a boyfriend right now. But he was persistent, so he figured a woman's refusal meant yes, and he knows it, so he kissed her. Farrell came up behind him and told him that he hadn't paid his bills yet. Now they had one more thing to settle. The man got pissed off and started asking who the hell Farrell was. He's talking to Kirsten, so let him fuck off. Kirsten realized what was about to happen, so she warned Farrell of the impact. But Farrell is no ordinary man. He's already defeated 2 ghosts, and some asshole is no match for him. And then asked him if he'd ever been taught not to get distracted in a fight. He himself was surprised that he was so strong and his legs so light. Brian was lying on the floor like a lowlife trying to say something to Farrell, but he couldn't. And when I got up, I was able to say that I wanted him to just wait. Kirsten realizes he's gone and Farrell is in very big trouble for what he did. And Farrell ignored it and wondered when he got so strong. Kirsten realized he didn't know how serious this whole situation was. She imagined his whole gang retaliating for their head being kicked, and she was really worried about Farrell, that she was gonna get him in a lot of trouble. And Farrell cheerfully said that next time he had to pay attention to his strength or he'd beat him to death. He also decided to take a nap and said he'd find him when he woke up. But she knew she couldn't go looking for him, and she was the reason Farrell was in trouble. She had to keep it from getting out of hand. Brian asked some man if he really wanted to be at the center of it all. At this point, he got a call from Kirsten, who he had signed as a pretty face and big breasts. This man asking Brian if he was sane? Now she wants him to put a stop to it. Maybe they can go out with her tonight. And then he and Brian called Mr. Lyle a genius and decided he'd deal with both of them together this time. They both started laughing nonstop like some kind of deranged maniac. Slowly night falls. There's some car coming along that tells the other to stop. Kirsten introduced to Farrell that this was her boss, Mr. Lyle. Farrell said hello to him. Mr. Lyle was an old, ugly man with a disgusting temperament. Kirsten asserted that he should apologize to him. He awkwardly agreed, and they went inside holding hands. She asked just to look at her before acting. However, he told her not to worry, and also Zoe was already standing in that room. Kirsten was here for the first time, which made Farrell a little surprised and wary. They came to some room, and Lyle asked them to go inside. This room was guarded by 2 men. Brian and 2 other people were sitting there, and he greeted Farrell and Kirsten, saying he'd been waiting a long time to get out. One of the men laughed, and the other asked if he was the man he had told them about. The red-haired man jumped up abruptly, and with incomprehension began shouting and asking if Farrell had beaten Brian. As Farrell and Kirsten came in, the doors behind them slammed shut, and not coincidentally, one by one, people began arriving, some armed with edged weapons. Kirsten got scared and started calling for Mr. Lyle, thinking he'd save her. He said not to be surprised, and stood directly behind Brian's chair, taking hold of it. "Welcome to your husband's domain, my lucky bride," Brian affirmed. They grabbed her, and when she realized what was going on, she started struggling and screaming. And of course 2 men were able to get her on the floor without much effort. Brian, holding Kirsten's hair in his hand and touching her face, asked Farrell, hadn't he been so strong this morning? And then he said he was the only one who could enjoy Kirsten and no one else. He joined her from behind and started maniacally yelling about how Farrell's morning kick was pretty cool, wasn't it? Farrell, on the other hand, didn't worry about it, and confirmed that it was indeed quite a kick. Okay, very cool. Really? Brian wanted to see if Farrell could be cool after a while. They continued to hold her, and he ordered his subordinates to begin the performance of the 2 men headed toward Farrell, holding edged weapons in their hands. And then suddenly something strange happened that the man couldn't see with his eyes. After which, apparently Farrell stood in the concentration of all the dust that had risen up. When the dust cleared, it was evident that he was standing at ease on his feet, thinking of his own, and his opponents lay breathless on the floor, one even foaming at the mouth. Brian and Lyle were very surprised, and didn't understand what was going on. How was this possible? And the man with the glasses and white hair was interested, and Farrell confirmed that Brian had actually asked for. He asked him to come here today. It'd be easier, and he punched Brian in the arm. And he figured Zoe could handle the rest of it, since it was her revenge after all. Farrell asked Kirsten not to be afraid, and to enjoy the upcoming big show. First of all, Zoe grabbed Brian right by the heart, even though he couldn't even see her. Lyle couldn't figure out who was behind it. Farrell? Who else could do it? But he's here, so it should be okay, right? He asked the man next to him. This man is a counselor for the group, name of Harris, an unremarkable young man. Lyle realized that since it was very important, he had to get rid of this guy, otherwise he wouldn't be able to show his face anywhere else. He ordered the red-haired man to go into battle rather than slow down, to which he agreed to. This red-haired man took out his nunchakus, ready to use them against Farrell. And Farrell decided to ask one of them if he was Mr. Lyle, or was he wrong, and pointed a finger at him. And he decided to point a finger at him in return. He began to suspect that he was going crazy, or was already crazy. But Lyle called Farrell a bastard, and claimed he was messing with the wrong guy, and it was his own fault. Counting down from 3, and this redhead swings his nunchakus. Farrell continued counting, and the red-haired man's nunchuck stopped right in front of his face. Lyle didn't realize what was happening, and Farrell had already counted to 1. This red-haired guy jumped one of his own and started yelling the word eat. And he started punching, but not Farrell as expected, but Lyle, who was giving him orders. The white-haired one saw it all and wondered what was going on. Lyle realized he'd probably lost his mind, but it was too late to do anything about it. He hit the man again with all his might and hit him square in the nose, breaking the bone. He was in incredible pain from having his nose broken like that, and his subordinate, Kirsten, stood behind Farrell and tried to talk to him, for she was afraid of everything that was going on here. He exhaled, and with a smile on his face, asserted that everything was fine and not to worry. Brian lay lifelessly on the floor. Like a lowlife, there was nothing he could do to counteract it. The white-haired man said he expected that, and it got interesting, really interesting for him. Brian confronted her this time, but well, it was his misfortune, and the white-haired man himself had nothing to do with it. And he looked at Zoe, trying to say something telepathically, which made Zoe incredibly surprised. How could he see her? Who was he? Farrell, too, was very much surprised at this fact, and pondered why this was so, and how it was possible. Law began asking those on the floor why they still hadn't gotten up, and ordered them to do so immediately. Farrell realized that it looks like he's back. Then he should just eat it, that's all. The redhead kept saying he wanted to eat, and throwing himself at these people. Mr. Lyle couldn't understand why the hell his subordinate was beating him. It's not right. The man looked just like a beaten sack of shit who can't defend himself. The red-haired man stood over the battered body like some kind of monster. But stop. It was the same ghost, and Farrell told him to come back. Yeah, he came back into this body. He came out of that poor red-haired man's body, and the man didn't know what was going on. And Farrell mockingly asked Mr. Lyle if he would like to continue, but Lyle still had something to say, that Farrell had the last word, and he would listen to whatever he had to say. And all he said was that if anything happened to Kirsten, he'd be responsible. And now he's completely pulled the ghost out of that body with one command. Lyle didn't understand what was happening, why his red-haired subordinate, who had just beaten him, had fallen to the ground. He decided on his knees that from now on he would consider him his big brother. Farrell said it's better this way. I should have just resisted and obeyed. And Lyle said he'd do anything. They could talk about anything. Kirsten wanted to say something to Farrell, but he interrupted her and said that a good neighbor is much better than a brother, right? She also wanted to say something to Mr. Liu, but he started telling her, calling her Mrs. Sister-in-law, that she was too polite. He was all beat up and teary-eyed and snotty, and started saying that she could go to work tomorrow as she pleased. Kirsten started waving her off and saying she wasn't a daughter-in-law, and someone took her by the arm. She asked not to talk nonsense, and realized that Farrell had taken her hand. He took her embarrassed hand and said that's it, they could go back in peace. And then they went out the very door they'd slammed shut before. And Zoe hovered, keeping the room quiet, but her head full of thoughts. She hovered looking at Brian, who had been beaten so badly that he wouldn't regain consciousness for some time to come. And then she started saying he ruined her, the demon, but now she can start her life over. So she left and added that she hoped they'd never meet again, ever. He told Zoe it was time to go, and Kirsten immediately asked who he was talking to which he nervously replied that he wasn't talking to anyone, because he couldn't tell her the truth. Some people were sitting in the room arguing. A man was yelling at someone named Horace, asking again about what he said about his son being killed by a ghost. It was the same bespectacled guy who said he never figured out where the guy Farrell came from who made the mess, so they don't need to be reckless. This man broke his cup. He can't sit idly by. He must take revenge at any cost. And if the bespectacled man isn't ready, someone else will. And the bespectacled man said he had nothing more to say in that case. Let them sort it out themselves. Some old person suggested that Horace just wasn't ready for this, and if they help him get revenge, all the privileges Horace had will be theirs. The hustle and bustle of the town. At the house, Kirstine was telling Farrell to get up. He hid under the covers, said he was tired and asked me to let him sleep a little longer. Kirsten confirmed that she had thought about feeding him more food, but it seems no longer necessary. After he said that, he jumped out of bed and said he was going as fast as he could. But as it turned out, he was naked completely, so Kirsten turned away in embarrassment. At first, he couldn't understand what was wrong with him, why she was reacting the way she was. He hadn't done anything, but Farrell quickly realized he was completely naked and didn't know what to do. Expectedly, she slammed the door shut as hard as she could and called him a creep. Naked in bed, he realized he wasn't used to this life. He really wasn't. They were walking somewhere, and Farrell asked, didn't she want to feed him lots of food? Then why did she bring him to the park? To which she said it's only because it's the shortest route. And while they were secretly being watched from behind a tree by a suspicious man, Farrell kept trying to explain that it wasn't his fault. No need to get angry. And they met some people on the way, which made Kirsten frightened, and Farrell had a misunderstanding of. He really couldn't understand who these people were, for they were too strange. They were Brian's subordinates, but they didn't look human, like mindless zombies. It didn't take Farrell long to assert that what he'd said before was useless, did it? But when he saw Mr. Liu, he quickly realized that something was definitely wrong. All these shells of men headed toward Farrell, cold weapons in hand, and all those blades came straight at them. Farrell once again covering Kirsten, for she was defenseless. But then he's rescued by his faithful helpers, and he's surprised that they can go out even during the day, and they started knocking the guns out of their hands, after which Zoe explained that if they stayed close to him, they were safe. Zoe realized that they were different from those who had come before, and Farrell added that he thought he sensed something too, and without thinking long, he used his ability, yin-yang eyes, which allowed him to see souls and more. With those eyes he saw, it's a puppet trick. They're controlled by some invisible threads. Zoe also pointed out that it comes out they are ghost puppets, and Farrell remembered Zoe saying this when she found out his ghost wasn't a ghost puppet. Then he asked what was going on, and Kirsten, who had intervened between them, thought it was for her, and said that she herself didn't know. Zoe started saying that there are powerful sorcerers in town, and they catch bad and violent ghosts, and do bad things for the bad guys. Farrell noticed his ghost, and asked if he wanted to try it. He was full of joy. It flew, and Kirsten thought it was for her again, and asked what to try. This time, Lau got defensive, and realized that this ghost wanted to take over his body again, and Zoe pounced on him, not knowing what that ghost, Farrell's first ghost, was waiting for. But as soon as she got close, he effortlessly tossed her aside with a normal hand punch, then told his men to go ahead and kill Farrell and Kirsten. They, like true zombies, began to snarl and run toward Farrell, who was standing still. But after all, he's not an ordinary man, he's Satan, and he'll easily fight back. One minion he threw that punch at another, and knocked out the bonus in real life. And Lyle, who also had no consciousness of his own, was dismayed that his subordinates were scattered like weaklings. One of the flying minions held in his hand a knife, which on the fly struck something, the blade of the, and that something was Lyle's neck, and it just chopped his head off, and it rolled across the floor. Farrell was very surprised that with one kicking skill, he was able to hit one opponent with another, and then they also killed the third one. Kirsten couldn't believe it all. She got so nervous she passed out. That's when the police arrived, and Farrell didn't know how he could help Kirsten. Some young and beautiful girl got out of the police car and asked who called the police. It's CID Vice Captain Neal, and when she opened her eyes, she noticed something, namely the picture of Farrell trying to kiss Kirsten, who's passed out, and the decapitated man next to him. Whereupon she immediately drew her gun and ordered him to stop immediately, calling him a deranged murderer. Of course she thought he was a deranged lunatic, and she tried to stop him. Farrell was just not ready for the gun, and didn't know if he could stand up to it. That's the reason he really had to take his hands off Kirsten, to save his life. Kirsten had a bunch of blood coming out of her nose, for some unknown reason, but it was definitely bad. Farrell was in a panic, and didn't know what to do to help her, so he started doing what he could. The policewoman called him crazy again, and slowly put the gun back in its holster, and then rushed toward him, asking him to let her do something, namely, to keep him quiet so he wouldn't do anything else, because in her eyes, he looked like a psychotic maniac. She was still able to defeat Farrell without much effort or a gun, and some man behind the trees said he'd already overpowered him, then angrily mused that Farrell would be busy for a while, which would give the man time to prepare for the next move. Farrell and that policewoman came down to the station to sort things out, and one of the cops asked this girl, did she accidentally throw the defendant to the ground again, and then he became a vegetable? And what do they do now? The policeman was surprised at Farrell's condition, for he had just been very energetic, after which he began to ponder. The deceased was nicknamed the Dragon Brother. His background is quite complicated. The other victims at the scene are all slackers, and Farrell, who he thought was an idiot, doesn't look like a dangerous criminal. However, Xiaonan tried to change his mind, saying that if he thought that, it was because he hadn't seen what Farrell had done. He realized he'd been mistaken for a murderer, and he had to do something about it, because his goal was to become Satan. But he is a murderer. He became a murderer when he killed that man, and it's gonna be hard to justify it. Farrell looked at Xiaonan, realizing that he was a killer, and it would not be easy to get away with it. Xiaonan just couldn't stand it when that psycho she thought was staring at her like that. And she remembered she almost forgot to tell you something. Zhang Bin, from the X group, died. The warden couldn't believe it because he didn't see Farrell as a killer, just a regular kid. Xiaonan explained that she has been spying on him for 2 years. Humph, the X group can hide it from others, but not from her. A source told her that before he died, he was dating a young guy, and that psycho Farrell pretty much fits that guy's description. Zhang Bin died, and then the Dragon Brother, this crime can be solved, and then grabbed a pencil, pointed it at Farrell, and confirmed that he was. But she stopped when she realized he was no longer in the chair, and for a while the room was dead silent. Xiaonan stood up, wanting to know where he was, and how dared he run away from her. As she expected, he ran away, so she had to catch up with him as soon as she could. And the fact that he ran away, she thought it confirmed that he was involved in the case. Farrell stood in front of Satan's palace, deep in thought about the situation that had occurred. He's become a murderer, and what does he do now that he doesn't realize he's in Satan's palace? And where's Kirsten? And then he noticed where he was, and he started to get angry. What the hell? Why is he here again? A very bright light appeared, just like the first time, but this time some kind of mechanism began to work. This mechanism gave out a sign saying that a new mission was completed. Life and Death Book authorization was obtained, and asked it to check its functionality. Farrell ordered that light to stop immediately, for he must find Kirsten. That wall did start to change, which he theorized was because he was thinking too much. He climbed out somewhere in space from where he could see the doctor standing over Kirsten, and then a hand reached out to her, and Farrell realized it was a bad case. She had to be rescued, which is why he just jumped out of that dimensional portal without a second thought, and speeding into the room right off his foot, shattering the glass and knocking the attending physician back. The man literally couldn't get up from that blow, and Farrell was acting like a hero. Farrell walks over to Kirsten and starts to ask if she's okay, but suddenly the door to the room opens abruptly. It was Xiaonan who, after searching for him, finally found him. In the midst of all this commotion, Farrell saw some entity again, using the eyes of Yin Yang, while she was telling him not to waste her time by assuming he wasn't sober. The entity was already sneaking up on her. Farrell realized that he couldn't let Kirsten get hurt, and warned the officer of the danger. The entity was hovering around her, but the officer didn't see it, and simply told Farrell that he had nowhere to run, and it was better to surrender now. He tried to stop her and explain that it's not what she thinks it is, and sirens were starting to sound outside the window, and Farrell knew what was happening. He looked out the window and saw a whole bunch of police cars surrounding the building. All the police who were there were scrambling to capture Farrell at any cost, as an especially dangerous criminal, and Farrell knew it was bad for him, because the more people, the more problems. The officer thought he was caught, and she won, catching another maniacal rapist. Farrell noticed again the entity that was already getting too close to the officer, so he decided to take action. So he summoned his hungry ghost. The ghost immediately rushed into action, for its master needed help, and bit the entity. But in order to give the command, Farrell had to crouch down and point his hand up, and he accidentally put his fist under the officer's skirt. He immediately realized what he had just done, so he was covered in cold sweat, but he still tried to assert that he could explain everything. The officer didn't expect that, so she got very embarrassed and immediately slapped him in the face, calling him a goddamn psychopath. Farrell stopped the officer and ordered Zoe to protect Kirsten at all costs. She didn't understand who Zoe was or why she had to obey a maniac, a psychopath, a rapist, a pervert. But Farrell wouldn't listen to her and told the hungry ghost to go on, and the officer told him he couldn't do it this time. They ran down the corridor as fast as they could to put Farrell's plan into action. Whoever sent this entity obviously wants them upstairs. No other way. And then Farrell noticed that Zoe was with him and not Kirsten, and she explained that she'd already said they could keep a certain distance from Farrell, and it was clear, so they didn't have much choice, in which case they needed to capture the enemy as quickly as possible to keep Kirsten safe. When they got to the roof, they finally saw the one who started the thread that led them here. It was the old man. Farrell realized it was the name he used to make him a killer, setting up that fight, and everything to hold him off. He's really pissed at him, and now that he's here, they're gonna make it quick. And then Farrell ordered Zoe and the hungry spirit to take him, and fast, because he had to go back to protect Kirsten. The old man, in turn, folded his hands into a sort of seal, muttering something about the two first powers. He used an ability called combination charms. This ability gave him a sort of veil, which made it impossible for them to see him, as if he had disappeared. And Zoe remembered again that ever since she'd become a ghost, the thing that scared her the most was that she liked the power of this Taoist. Farrell couldn't understand what was going on, and the hungry ghost began to show gestures by which you could see anxiety and excitement. This sort of clue from the hungry ghost helped Farrell dodge the blow. They realized it was very dangerous, so they formed a group, and they stood back to back. Zoe reminded Farrell that he possesses yin-yang eyes. He apologized and said he had forgotten about their properties. Anyway, he has a unique skill. He said, show yourself, and the search for this Taoist began. But in the end, even with them, he didn't see anything that shocked them both, because that was their trump card. The hungry ghost, on the other hand, remained on the alert, and with the help of his particularly sensitive sniffing, was able to smell some odor of. No one expected it, but thanks to his sniff, he was able to smell the Taoist and bite his arm. Maybe something will come of it, Farrell thought, for he had a plan to defeat and he started telling Zoe this plan very quietly. And then she was surprised and asked him if he was sure. Farrell really didn't expect a hungry ghost to be some kind of mascot for him. It was a distraction, and Zoe picked it up at the same time Farrell swung at it, and sprinted to his stomach as hard as he could. But for a reason, it was all his plan. This blow made the ghost begin to vomit, and Farrell immediately ordered Zoe to proceed with his plan. They made him vomit right up in the air, and the vomit spread all over the roof. And with the help of the vomit-hungry ghost, the Taoist became visible. And it turned out just as Farrell thought it would. Even though this way was disgusting, it was their only option. When the Taoist was in sight, it should not have been difficult to defeat him. So Farrell ordered Zoe to fight his. She'll attack from above, and he from below. It'll be a combined ghost and Satan attack. But they were out of luck. The Taoist wasn't so simple that his power lay in a single technique, and he started combining chakra again. It was called a whirlwind, and unlike that one, it was more combative, and it swept Farrell and Zoe out of the battlefield. The whirlwind caused dust to rise that blocked all view, and as it turned out, the Taoist was already behind Zoe's back. He put his hand between her breasts and started using some sort of technique, and it had something to do with Zoe, and everything around her went purple. While all this was happening to her, Farrell was only trying to move away from the whirlwind that had sealed him into the wall of and when he looked up, he had no time to rest, for he saw something that shocked him. Namely, there was Zoe, falling head over heels, completely exhausted. Farrell couldn't let her die, so he jumped in after her. He was trying to figure out what could have happened while he was stunned. What happened to Zoe? Farrell knew he had to deal with the Taoist, so he ordered the hungry ghost to capture him. But he didn't move, for he was afraid of whoever was standing right behind Farrell's back. He noticed it, but it was too late, and the blow had reached his. That blow slammed Farrell back into the wall, only harder. And according to his research, Farrell is not a Taoist. Then what is he? According to the Taoist himself, he's just a kid who knows how to wave his arms, having learned such small skills from somewhere. And he's too young to beat him. The difference in experience and skill is obvious. The hungry ghost lit up with the exact same fire as Zoe, and Farrell was once again slammed into the wall. At one point Farrell thought he was really dying, and that was the end of his story. But the Taoist didn't want to give him a chance, so he headed straight in his direction. And then a voice came from behind telling the psycho to stop running and surrender, which confused the Taoist. It was that policewoman, but even her gun won't help against this Taoist, who can move faster than a bullet. Taoist realized it was a policeman, and the rest of the police squad was approaching them as well. Once up on the roof, they all pointed their guns and ordered us to stand still. That officer asked Farrell if he was surrendering, and clarified if it was his partner or not, and then confirmed that he's charged with murder, indecent exposure, fleeing to avoid punishment, assault at a hospital, and on all these facts, he's under arrest, so he's handcuffed. The Taoist was also ordered to lie on the ground with his hands behind his head, but he just smiled and decided it was even better than the plan with the doctor. And of course, he wasn't going to give up. He started pulling something out of his sleeve. It was a combined arcane skill. It was called a kind of shadow theater, and it looked both creepy and mesmerizing. All these shadows started attacking the cops, who in turn couldn't fight back. These shadows also enveloped the officer, making her confused, but not realizing what was going on. Farrell didn't see anything, and didn't understand what was happening now, but he knew it was definitely something important, and the cops' bodies were out of their control. So the officer pointed the gun right at Farrell, which resulted in her unceremoniously shooting Farrell right in the head. And now he was back in that space, not knowing what had happened or where he was. Into the screen that showed what was outside, he saw the Taoist, and tried to understand what had happened to him. And he was also wondering if he was still Satan or not. But the screen only showed that the owner was dead, and that was the problem, which made Farrell angry, saying he knew it already. He was offered to see the manual of his skill. He didn't get it. In Yang eyes, he knows how to use them. He didn't know what was going on, but he saw and clearly realized that the police weren't working against him. The system asked him to check the instruction of his skill. However, he didn't listen, and asked what was going on there. Why did the Taoist freeze? So Satan can die too? Hell, where'd that keyboard come from anyway? He remembers the system telling him to study the manual. No, wait, he's missing something really important. But what is it? Speaking of skills, he not only has Yang eyes, but also a book of life and death. Farrell realized that the system never offers useless things. Who can guard against death? Who can make one live? The book of life and death, right? The system will help him defeat the Taoist. He started typing something on this keyboard with great enthusiasm. Some incredible power, energy, began to ooze out of the screen, a great deal of, and some outline of a man created from the energy appeared on the ceiling. That light literally blinded Farrell, and he had to put his hands over his eyes to keep from going blind. And then some man shows up and says that anything outside of his goals should be eliminated, and then he asks why Farrell called him. Farrell himself was incredibly frightened, not knowing what the man was talking about. He didn't understand a thing. This man was walking around this space and looking around, trying to figure out something about where he was and what he needed to do. He went to this very window that showed what was beyond this space. Farrell couldn't figure out if it was really a Motsu. Was he an exhibitionist or something? He came to realize that this is the world after many years, and supposedly, by the rules of this world, he's supposed to do something, namely, dress like this. He looked really cool with a Cuban cigar in his mouth. Farrell was even more surprised that not only his appearance, but also his manner of speech had changed drastically. He added that in terms of skills, he was as good as a guy named Lu Ban, and also, he knows all about Farrell. And since he's a man who's willing to become Satan for peace, then he asked to be allowed to help him, and with his incredible strength easily lifted Pharaoh by his shirt, and just threw him with all his might into this dimensional rift without explaining anything. Inside that space, Pharaoh was literally being torn, stretched across the flatness of the space. When he landed, he was unconscious and drooling from his mouth, and when he came up, he saw some really creepy thing coming out of the floor beneath him. It really scared him. What was going on, where he was, and who they were, that's what was on his mind. But one thing was clear, he was in a trap that he had to get out of. He began to sink in that mud, and the arms of the monsters around him pulled him even faster. But the man had no intention of leaving him, and was on his way to help, because Pharaoh couldn't have done it on his own. He had snatched Pharaoh out of that swamp of ghosts without much difficulty, and asserted that now he would do something. They have the materials for his armor, the strong man asserted confidently, then grabbed him by the chest and started using some kind of force that made Pharaoh glow with a red light. And all these ghosts started to get weirdly sucked right inside Pharaoh. While all the ghosts were coming in, this man chanted an exorcism mantra. Pharaoh was conscious, but he couldn't understand what was happening, nor could he do anything about it. He's literally absorbing all these ghosts, like he's got some kind of core inside him. The man asked Pharaoh, shrouded in ghosts, how he was feeling right now, and Pharaoh thought that instead of helping him, he was trying to kill him. But he immediately refuted those thoughts, explaining that the key to the armor was Pharaoh himself. But he couldn't understand how he could be any kind of key. Began to compress the space inside Pharaoh, which was part of the man's plan. He began to say to Pharaoh to hold his peace with virtue. Where there is a will, there is a way. Only a mighty heart can control the force of. And finally decided to ask if Pharaoh was sure he was ready to take this incredible power and use it for good. He went on to philosophize about how a good bow allows arrows to fly far and fast. A good horse travels farther with a heavy load. Now, bow and horse ready. Can Pharaoh control them? However, Pharaoh himself did not realize what the bow and horse were. Is this man even sure he is really Satan? Something strange began to happen to his whole body, as if a ghost was taking possession of him, and half his face was no longer his, but ghostly, and he reflected that there probably wasn't a shittier Satan in the world than him. He closed his eyes and started to remember the moment everything in his life went wrong. And first, he remembered how his girlfriend left him. He thought the system told him that the ghost control mission had failed, the trial was complete, but the shithost would be removed. Also remembered the officer who slapped him, calling him a psychopath. As a result of all these memories coming back to him, it seems he was able to embrace that power, and something big started happening. Out of the whole body, there appeared some sort of eye that opened, and it was itself red in color. It surprised the man a little, and then I began to disintegrate, for it began to crack, and out of it came Pharaoh's hand, who had no intention of surrendering, but wanted to subdue this power like Satan. He began to climb out of this cluster of compressed souls, in the form of an eye, but he was no longer a human being. And even though he's abandoned, he's not scum. After saying that, he started trying to tear that eye with the hands he already freed. Finally getting out, he realized where the power comes from. Just like that, Pharaoh was wearing some kind of azure armor that looked just incredible. This man noticed that Pharaoh looks exactly as described in the ancient texts, but not quite. He couldn't figure out how it worked, but no matter, at least he wouldn't die in a battle with a Taoist. Then I asked the man not to go far away, because he had a lot of questions, but he began to say that there were a lot of useful things in hell. But first of all, Pharaoh resolved to order him to bring it back. Immediately, he stood and literally began to absorb the power as best he could, and looked incredibly dangerous while doing so. And yet, he was brought back to reality. This officer told him to get up, whereupon she immediately fired a shot. He had ghost eyes around his neck that he could look at everything around him, and he actively used that ability. The bullet flew straight at him, at full speed, but he stopped it with 2 fingers without much trouble. The Taoist started to wonder what was going on. Is that a necklace around his neck? And what's wrong with his hands? But Pharaoh himself said it's too early to be surprised. It's still a long way off. He had a different speed that was even imperceptible to the eye. Grabbed the bindings that the Taoist was controlling and tore them. causing the officer to lose consciousness and fall to the floor. He's decided to say something to her, even though she probably can't hear him. Farrell repeats to her that he is not crazy, even though he himself was in the form of Satan, which he was. Dallas couldn't understand how things could turn out like this. A boy who couldn't even dodge a normal attack. How did he become so much stronger in such a short time? He ran from that spot to Zoe in a heartbeat to see if she was okay. Farrell apologized for relying on them. So now it's gonna be different. Now it's his turn to protect them when the enemy is too strong and they can't handle it. Farrell's attitude towards the Taoiseach just pissed him off, and he told him to stop talking and start fighting. The Dallas immediately threw blades imbued with some sort of energy, and they flew towards Farrell, but it was all to no avail, and Farrell again, thanks to his eyes and speed, managed to grab each blade and squeeze it like paper. In addition to his anger, there are now 100 hungry souls in his body, ready to tear this Taoist to pieces. He's manipulating the lush to do evil, right? In that case, let him feel their anger, feel their malice, and repent to Farrell. Whereupon he lightning broke his arm, and asked if he could feel anything else. Farrell played with the Taoist like a toy, and his hand was no harder than jelly. He was Satan incarnate. Of course, Dallas was not going to give up yet. He was not a weakling as he thought, so he decided to counterattack, after which he claimed he had an ace up his sleeve and was incredibly angry. That ace was Kirsten, whom he lifted with the help of his ropes. Behind Farrell stood the officers that the Taoist had gotten hold of, but it didn't matter. Even without his manipulative arm, he still has his other, stronger arm, and he can keep fighting. He clutched Kirsten with his fetters, and to prove that before, he estimated the strength of Farrell's. Of course, he can say he's not, but he'll show him. Then he used a combo spell, and his arm was clamped with his own bonds. This ability he called the Supreme Secret, and shouted its name at the top of his voice. He held Kirsten aloft, and his hold on her body, where his slings touched, began to crackle. And the Taoist asked, "The wrath of 100 spirits?" The number of souls tamed by him is far from few. Farrell just prided himself on his power, didn't he? So what's he? Let him come and defeat the Taoist. Farrell called it real childish, to which the Taoist thought he was frightened, and asserted that young people are always showing off when they learn a new trick. But Farrell understood, and so he said that only the Taoist was showing off, and he stuck out his tongue like a child, and told Faray to come and beat him, and let him prove with his strength that he was stronger than he was. He called the Taoist a real idiot, to which the Taoist started to get angry, and say that Farrell is still clueless. Will he continue if this Crumb's life is coming to an end? Farrell realized he was right, and he needed to save Kirsten, because she was falling apart. Thanks for watching. If you want part 2, like, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with your friends.